Hello, I am Greg Lombard Ray, and I am leading this session on understanding the Old Testament, 7 keys. Glad that you can watch this video. So, a little bit of background on me, really quickly, is that I've got a bachelor's degree from Chapman University in Orange, California, and a master's of divinity degree from Bright Divinity School at Texas Christian University. This is on the screen. You can see my three significant Old Testament professors who helped teach all of this. In addition to that, there is a 38-week intensive Bible study done by Upper Room called Disciple Bible Study. I've led that a few times, which helped me integrate all of my college and seminary knowledge. Preached on the Old Testament, read through the entire Bible on several occasions. And most importantly for me is that I've experienced the presence and insights of God through the reading and the studying of the Old Testament, which brings me this passion to do this training. So why am I interested in doing this? I love what Terry Hort Owens, the general minister and president of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, says in her book, Staying at the Table, Being the Church That We Say We Are. And she talks about spiritual formation is vital, and spiritual formation comes through embracing Scripture. And she talks about biblical literacy, understanding and being able to interpret Scripture. But when she talks about biblical literacy, she is not talking about dogmatic interpretations. She's talking about a lifestyle of continuous, faithful reading and the critical study of biblical text. And she says we must develop the skills to wrestle with the Bible. So the first thing is learning what is in the text is that first step, and that we should make it an integral part of spiritual formation for all those in our congregations. And so this is just one step in helping that to happen. And I thoroughly agree with her. Scripture has been so important to my relationship with God. So in this class, talking about the 7 keys, this is an outline of the 7 keys that we're going to be talking about in this training. One is going to talk about the Bible as a library of 66 books, and then going to talk about the authorship of the Bible, the location, where does the Bible take place in the world, the primary cast of characters, the temple itself, which is vital to understanding the Old Testament and the New Testament as well. And then the Old Testament, well, the biblical viewpoint of a 3-tiered universe, which is different than our view of the universe. And we'll look at that. And then going to look at the Old Testament history in light of 7 eras, just to give you a handle on that. An extra word on this is that I'm going to be giving you this outline of the 1,000 years of the Bible covered in the Old Testament, 1,000 years, right? But also, if you're looking for a narrative one, Psalm 78, 105, 106, and Psalm 136 all have narrative histories of what I'm going to outline for you. So if you want to, in addition to this kind of integrate the narrative story with this outline that I'll be giving you, that will be extremely beneficial. And in Acts chapter 7, the disciple of Jesus, Stephen, gives this a long speech in chapter 7 and summarizes the Old Testament. Another framework to look at that right before he is stoned to death. So that's quite the story in itself. So let's start with the Bible, a library of 66 books. There are 39 books in the Old Testament, and there are 27 books in the New Testament. Now, here's a fun thing. If you want to remember, the way I do it is 3 times 9 equals 27. So 39 books in the Old Testament, 27 books in the New Testament. My summary is that the Old Testament is the story of God's grace for Israel, the people of Israel, and the New Testament, the story of God's grace for the world. It's a little bit more overlap than that, but you get the point. The Bible contains many types of literature: law, narrative, poetry, wisdom literature, prophetic literature, gospels, letters, apocalyptic literature. So here's a great picture, right? The Bible, it's a bunch of books on a shelf. It is a library of 66 books. And in our Christian tradition history, we've divided them up between law, history, poetry, major prophets, minor prophets, and that's the Old Testament. And the New Testament is gospel history, Paul's letters, letters to the church, things such as that. But let's look at that. You see all those books of law, history, poetry, major prophets, minor prophets. But you remember that the Old Testament is the Bible or the Holy Scriptures for the Jewish people. The Hebrew Bible, they call it Tanakh, and TNK, which is Torah, law, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, right? So law, prophets, and writings. So they divide their Bible up into just three sections. The first five books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and then 8 books of the prophets. But what's different is Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. We Christians put that in our history category. And then Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12, they have each of those books on one scroll each. There's a scroll of Isaiah, a scroll of Jeremiah, a scroll of Ezekiel, and then the 12, what we call minor prophets, are all on one scroll themselves. Then Ketuvim, the writings, those are 11 books of writings. So like us, it's Psalms, Proverbs, we call that poetry, Job, Song of Songs. Those are, and Ecclesiastes, we call those our poetry, right? But then Ruth, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, and Nehemiah, and Chronicles. So we often consider those as historical books, but the Jews, they put that in the writings, so which says already there's a different view that we look at than the originators, those who are the people who wrote the Old Testament. So wanted to call your attention to that. What about the authorship? So in the Old Testament, there are many unknown or unidentified authors. The tradition attributes the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, to Moses, but Moses dies before the books or even those books are finished. But many scholars, certainly the ones that I follow, talk about Genesis through Deuteronomy written by several different sources, 4 different sources. And then during the time of the exile, which we'll talk about later, those sources were blended together into the Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy that we know of. King David likely wrote a number of the Psalms that are attributed to him. Then the New Testament, there are again multiple authors. 13 of those books are attributed to Paul, those letters. Half of the books are identified, so Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but there's no name that a guy named Matthew or Mark or Luke or John wrote those books. We don't know that, or if John was the gospel writer or was the same as the disciple of Jesus. So we're not sure about those things. And technically, for my spirituality and God speaking to me through scriptures, the authorship is interesting, but not vital. So that's from my perspective. So the location, where does the Bible story take place? Well, if you recognize the Mediterranean Sea, and we look a little bit more west, there's Greece and there's Rome. We'll see that on later maps. And the area takes place through Mesopotamia, which is the land between the rivers, and in modern day Iraq, Iran, those sorts of things, and go through here. This is called the Fertile Crescent. You notice that this is all green. That's because this is desert land. So if you were going to plant crops and grow crops to feed your people, it needed to be done here. If you were going to travel between Egypt and Mesopotamia, you had to go right here through what we call the Holy Land, through Jerusalem and Jericho and all of those, the Fertile Crescent. This is where the Sumerians were originally, and then the Akkadians were here and that nation. But then what we talk about here's another map. There's Turkey, right? And what we've got here, this kind of combines several. So Sumer and Akkad, where the Akkadians came from. And then after that, the Assyrians ran this area. So let's take a look at those maps. So here's the Assyrian Empire in its heyday, which is 824 BC, and then the Assyrian Empire in 671. And you'll see that this later area, it covers the Holy Land, everything except for Judah. So Judah was trapped and had to pay money to the Assyrians, but they pretty much still had their own country. But we'll but the rest of the Holy Land was controlled by Assyrian. And then the Babylonians came in and conquered the Assyrian Empire. And then the Babylonian Empire went through here and down again, controlled Jerusalem and the Holy Land, right? And then after that, the Persian Empire took over from the Babylonian Empire, and you can see their empire. And here's Jerusalem and Judah, and where the Jewish people are, and also this part of Egypt. And then after the Persian Empire, right? Now we've got the Greek Empire. You've heard of Alexander the Great. Well, this is the land that he went and conquered the Persian Empire. And then after the Greek Empire, you notice that it was the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire was in charge of the Holy Land, which is right here, and Jerusalem and Judea and Galilee when Jesus was alive. So the Bible covers lots of empires. But what you notice, let me just do this again, is that if you want to have an empire and you want to take over Egypt, check it out. You've got to go through the Holy Land. So if Egypt wants to expand its empire, goes through the Holy Land. If Babylonia or the Assyrian Empire or whoever else wants to conquer, they go through there. So this land has been contested by whoever is trying to control this area around the Fertile Crescent. So this is the Arabian Desert here. So not a lot of people can grow food there. And so that's why these empires go around. So that's just a summary of the location of where the Bible story takes place. Who are the primary cast of characters? So in Genesis, the very first book of the Bible and of the Old Testament, major part of the story is Abraham and Sarah, or they start off in chapter 12 as Abram and Sarai. And then they, through the promise of God, have a son named Isaac. Isaac grows up and he marries Rebekah, and they have two children, Esau, who's the firstborn, and Jacob. And that's a fun story. They were twins wrestling in their mother Rebekah's womb. Then Jacob, who the promise comes through, he goes and marries Rachel and her sister Leah, and then they start a baby contest. So Rachel and Leah's handmaidens, so to speak, they start having babies with Jacob as well, but they're all attributed to Jacob. And Jacob, his name means heel catcher. And in Genesis, we read the story when the two twins, Esau and Jacob, who are wrestling in Rebekah's womb, and when they are born, when they come out, Jacob, the story goes that he was hanging on to Esau's heel. So Jacob is what they called him, or heel catcher. But in Genesis, I can't say the chapter, but he wrestles with an angel or wrestles with God. And after Jacob wrestles with God, in that process of wrestling God, God renames him Israel, which means one who strives with God. So Jacob becomes Israel, which is where we get the nation of Israel. But Israel, also known as Jacob, had 12 sons. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin, and one daughter, Dinah. But we talk about the 12 tribes of Israel, and so that's for the most part named after those 12 sons. Now, continuing the cast of characters, the term Hebrews literally means, it's from the word across the river, but it's a general term for Israel, for the Jews, and Hebrews. So 3 names for these one people. You get why sometimes the Old Testament is difficult to understand, right? All these names, but Hebrews, Israel, and sometimes Jews, it's the same thing. The Israelites technically means the descendants of Israel, which are divided up into 12 tribes. We're not going to go deeply into that, but when you're reading, you will discover that in Genesis, there's the son Joseph, but there's no tribe of Joseph because Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, they become a part of the 12 tribes, and Joseph has his lineage through them. Um, Levi, that 13th tribe, does not take possession of the land. They do not have any land holding in the nation of Israel. Who are the Jews? They're the descendants of the tribe of Judah, are the Jews, or Jude, right? So that's what's going on there. Sometimes it includes members of the tribe of Benjamin, but we don't have time to go into that. Then who is Moses? Moses is God's chosen one who leads in the book of Exodus. In Exodus chapter 3, God calls Moses to go back to Egypt and lead the Israelites, the Hebrews, out of slavery in Egypt and through the Exodus and into the promised land. So that's a major part of the story, especially in Exodus, but throughout the rest of the Old Testament, Moses is referred to, and in the New Testament, Jesus and others refer to Moses as well. Moses is a vital character. So, third page of primary cast of characters. When Israel leaves slavery in Egypt and goes and takes over the promised land, and they are divided into 12 tribes, northern tribes, 10 northern tribes, and 2 southern tribes. So King Saul is the first king, and he is the ruler over the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom. King David, he becomes the ruler over the 2 tribes in the south, and then eventually David becomes the ruler of all 12 tribes, and it's a united kingdom under King David. And we read about that in Samuel, the second book of Samuel. And then King Solomon, who is David's son and the heir, he rules over the United Kingdom of all 12 tribes also. And then when Solomon dies, it all goes bad and they're divided and conquered. And that's a part of the history that I'll refer to in the timeline. Now, talking about the temple. The temple is the place where became the central focus of Israelite worship in Jerusalem. King Solomon, David's descendant, so when he was the king, he started and built the temple around 957-ish BC. And that temple was destroyed by the Babylonians when the Babylonians took over the southern kingdom in 586. Then the Jews went up and they were in exile in Babylon. And when they returned, they began a second temple in the same spot. And that construction began around 536 BC. And the temple is said at first, initially, it wasn't as big or anything, but it was still a central part of worship. Then sometimes it's called the third temple, but that temple was renovated and expanded by King Herod the Great during the Roman Empire in about 20 BC. And then that's the temple that Jesus goes into when Jesus clears the temple and all of that stuff. But that temple was destroyed in 70 AD. So if you think about it, so that was basically 70 years of a temple versus Solomon's temple, which, about 400 years or so. So difference in those. But that's what we talk about, the temple, which plays a significant part. Oh, and here's a picture. So if you think about, this is Solomon's temple in this size, but here's Solomon's temple compared to Herod's expanded temple, right? And so I love this. So here's Solomon's temple and the site and the upper court and all of that versus an American football field, right? It's football season, so we see that, right? And then Herod's expanded temple carries a whole lot more, or covers a whole lot more ground. Now let's get to the 3-tiered universe. So at the time, they did not know that the earth revolved around the sun, or there was any space or anything like that. So the biblical writers, they understood it was a 3-tiered universe. There was heaven up above, um, uh, with a firmament which held the waters above apart, and across the firmament the sun, moon, and stars went, and then earth was there, and there was actually waters below it. So when you read Noah's flood story, it says something like, and the windows of heaven were opened, and it's not the windows, but the holes in the ground were opened, and so the springs from the ground and the water below came from above and came from below. So you can see that in the biblical framework. The Bible pictures it this way, and actually at the edge are those mountains which actually hold up the sky. It's where the firmament gets settled and attached to the ground on that. So that's the three-tiered universe that we see in Genesis and in Job and probably some of the Psalms. I don't have exact verses, but that's the gist of it. As you're reading the Old Testament, just keep in mind this is their picture. Okay. So I want to talk about the Old Testament in 7 eras, but first I want to highlight the two primary events of the entire Old Testament. Okay. The one is Exodus. So prior to the Exodus, God's people, the Israelites, end up in Egypt, and then they are enslaved there for about 400 years. And then the Exodus, they exit Egypt, led by Moses, and they go into the promised land and begin create their own little kingdom there with the northern and southern kingdoms and the United Kingdom. And then the exile happens when the northern kingdom is conquered by the Assyrians, and then the Babylonians conquer the southern kingdom a couple hundred years later. And we call that the exile, the major part of the exile, because the leaders and the rich and those who were in leadership in Jerusalem were forced marched, 500 miles, and they were forced to set up a new life in the city of Babylon for about 70 years, and then some of them returned back. So these are the two events. There's everything before the Exodus and how God's people became God's people and became enslaved, how God saved them and sent them forth to create their own kingdom, and then how that kingdom ended up in exile and getting conquered, and then how they were restored after the exile. And those are the two major events as you're reading the Old Testament. And here, let's just look at this. So Jews were enslaved in Egypt, and this is kind of how they left. And they went to Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai. They got the 10 Commandments. That's where that happened. And then they wandered and wandered and wandered and wandered and wandered and wandered and wandered. And after 40 years in the wilderness, they went in and came in from the south. Jericho is right up there. So that's the Exodus and what that looks like. And the captivity of Israel and Judah. So here, the Assyrian Empire, which I said came first, right? They were in the northern kingdom versus the southern kingdom, right? So their capital of the northern kingdom was Samaria, and the Assyrians conquered them. And what they did is they moved the Israelites all over the Assyrian Empire, and then they took people from the Assyrian Empire who were conquered and moved them into the land. So they took the northern kingdom people and spread them throughout their empire. And then they took people who were in the other parts of the Assyrian Empire and moved them in. This was their way to move people around and try to prevent rebellion. Because if the Israelites, the northern kingdom, were living elsewhere and new people are in there, it reduces the risk of rebellion. Versus when the Babylonians here, when they came in and took over Judah and the southern kingdom in Jerusalem, their strategy was taking all the religious leaders that weren't killed and the rich and the wealthy and the powerful, and they took them and moved them to Babylon, says, this is where you're going to be living now. And eventually, when the Persians conquered the Babylonians, then King Cyrus allowed people to return back to Judah. So that gives you an idea about this, so you can see what's going on there. So let's look at the 7 eras again. So what we've got is I'm going to go into more detail on this, but we've got is the prologue and then in Genesis chapter 12 is the promise of to Abram and Sarai, hey, I'm going to give you a land and I'm going to give you as many descendants as there are stars in the sky, right? And then that started, we got the 12 sons of Jacob, and they end up living in Egypt, and then they become slaves in Egypt. Moses comes along because God heard the Israelites cry, the Hebrews cry, and in chapter 3 of Exodus sends Moses, I want you to go to Egypt and tell Pharaoh to let my people go. And then they do go across and they escape. They get the 10 Commandments when they're wandering through the desert. And then they go and wander for 40 years in the desert. And then they eventually take over the Palestine, the Holy Land, and develop the nation of Israel. So after the Exodus, we get Exodus to the possession of the land. And then it's possession of the land, but it's pre-temple. And there are descendants and land, that promise right here. Then temple to the exile, they still have the descendants and the land. Then in the exile, there's still all sorts of Abraham and Sarah's descendants, but they've lost the land here during the exile. Then after the exile, those who returned, they've got descendants during the exile, descendants but no land, and then the restoration, descendants and land again. So what I want to do, is I want to stop this share. And I want to do a new share. And there it is. So this is the handout that hopefully you can get with this. And this is the Old Testament and history framework in 7 eras. And here on this document also you can see the narrative history of the Old Testament. So what we've got here is in Genesis 1 through 11. This is the creation, the flood, and we call this prehistory. There aren't dates attached to this. And then the promise of descendants and land given to Abraham and Sarah, originally Abram and Sarai, and then their names are changed. The 12 tribes origin, we get the descendants, and then the 12 tribes enter Egypt. So what happens there is that happens in Genesis 12 through 50, and in chapter 50, everybody's living in Egypt. Job, this is the setting for Job, but the book of Job, but probably not when it's written during this 12 tribes before moving to Egypt. That's kind of the setting for that. We call this Abrahamic covenant, land, people, and circumcision. And then kind of how did they get into slavery in Egypt? It results of broken human relationships. And what I mean by that is the Pharaoh and the leaders in Egypt, they enslaved other people. That's a broken human relationship. The Israelites did nothing wrong. They were simply victims in becoming slaves in Egypt. Then what we've got, that's all before the Exodus. And then here we've got the Exodus. So in the Exodus to possession of the land, the people cry out and God hears. Moses comes in and the plagues happen and the Passover, all that is in the book of Exodus right here. Then they get the 10 Commandments in Exodus chapter 20. And the 10 Commandments, you'll also find them in Deuteronomy 5. And then Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho and the conquest of the Holy Land. And that takes place in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and then Joshua. So now the people are living in the land, but it's pre-temple and there's no kings. So here it's the book of Judges. This covers Judges, Ruth, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And that's the judges who are ruling the land. And then King Saul becomes king. And then David becomes king. And then Solomon becomes king. And the first temple is built. That happens there. Then what we've got is the temple to the exile. We've got descendants in the land, and the kingdom splits after Solomon dies. The kingdom splits into 10 tribes in the north, 2 tribes in the south. That gets a little bit more complicated, but that's most helpful for right now. Then the northern kingdoms fall to Assyria, which I mentioned before, when the Assyrians swept in and took over and distributed the northern kingdoms throughout the Assyrian kingdom. And then the south falls to Babylon, and the temple is destroyed about 586. So you see that the north fell to Assyria in 722. The south falls to Babylon in 586. And the biblical books, this is 1st and 2nd Kings, 2nd Chronicles, Jonah, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah chapters 1 through 39, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Obadiah, perhaps Joel, perhaps Job is written during these times. So now we're in the exile. And I like just a way to look at this exile result is the result of a broken relationship with God. So what the prophets, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, what they all say is that the reason we are being conquered and thrown into exile, both northern kingdom and southern kingdom, is we have not done 2 things. We have not worshiped God only, broken that first commandment, just worship God. We've worshiped all these other gods also, and we have not taken care of the poor, the vulnerable, the widow, the orphan, the aliens. And the prophets are clear. The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, and God is ticked. So God is going to smoke you. That's what the prophets just are saying, especially Amos, Hosea, Isaiah. All of those are in there. So the exile is the result of a broken relationship with God. You did not love God. You did not love your neighbor. Off to exile you go. Then they're in exile about 70 years in living in Babylon. And so in exile, they have their descendants are still there. And there's the remnant, the leftovers still left in Jerusalem. But the rulers and the rich go to Babylon, like I said, and the remnant stays in Judah, Jerusalem, things such as that. This period is covered by Jeremiah, the book of Ezekiel, Daniel, Lamentations, Isaiah chapters 40 through 55 are covered here. And then we move down to the restoration. So in the restoration, and they go and get the land back at the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom never really recovers. So Persia conquers the Babylonian Empire, right? And then the Jews, King Cyrus lets the Jews return to Jerusalem and they rebuild the temple. Then the Jews return to Jerusalem again and start rebuilding Jerusalem's walls for protection. Now that's covered in Isaiah 56 through 66. Esther is living in the capital of the Persian Empire, which name escapes me right now, but King Ahasuerus, if I remember correctly, prior to the restoration. So Esther is still in exile there. And Ezra and Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, all right, they go back, and First Chronicles 9 and Second Chronicles 36 talks about this. Then Nehemiah comes back and starts rebuilding the walls. Ezra comes back and starts rebuilding the temple. Then they start rebuilding the walls. And the Psalms during the exile, that's when they believed that the Psalms, all those songs, started being compiled together because they were all over the place. And so they started putting them on one scroll. And many scholars believe that this is where it was during the exile that the Bible started becoming the Tanakh, Torah and the prophets and the writings were put together on scrolls because they didn't have the temple to worship in anywhere. So we better write these down. And also Pharisees started in the exile as well, in synagogues, and those things started there. That's Jesus stuff. Then what we've got, they return here, and then guess what? The Persian Empire got conquered by Alexander the Great. Right? So now we've got the Greeks come in, and they take over Judea and Egypt and all of that area. And And then Rome comes in and defeats the Greeks. Did I mention that the biblical history is over like 1,000 years, right? And so they defeated the Greeks, and now they're in charge of the Holy Land. So this is covered by Daniel, First Maccabees. That's part of the Catholic Bible, is that there's the Old Testament, the New Testament, and then there's the Apocrypha and Deuterocanonical books, of which Maccabees is one, and possibly Daniel 7 represents here. And so now we're in 322 is when the Greeks conquer the um, the Holy Land and Jerusalem, and then Rome comes in 63 BC. And in between, Jerusalem and Judah actually had independence around 167. The Maccabees led a revolt and kicked the Greeks out and took over the temple again. That's where the story of Hanukkah comes in, but we're not going to talk about that today either. There's so much involved in all of this. I hope that was helpful so far. Let me get a new share. So if we were live here with me, I would let you answer a bunch of questions. This would be a perfect time for that. But what I want to do right now is let you know that this Old Testament 7 Keys is actually part of a 5-part series. So the next one is hearing God, the heart and wisdom of the Old Testament, which is really cool, which will be about an hour's series. And then the Gospels, an overview of that, fear, sin, and salvation, and then Acts through Revelation, which is after Jesus died and is resurrected, all the way through the book of Revelation, calling that theology on the run. And then looking at the entire Bible, I want to talk about 7 value systems that we can see in the Bible. And so that helps explain some of that difficult stuff that we just go, yikes, I can't believe we call this the Holy Bible when you find this stuff in it. And that shows the different value systems, because bottom line, I think it would be fair to say that everybody's doing the best that they can with the information they have at the time. So that last one helps us see where people were coming from and why some of the seriously nasty stuff is in the Bible in both ends. All right, so I'm glad that you have joined me. I hope that you've appreciated this. And if you'd like, you could put comments below, because I'll put this on my YouTube channel in case you'd like to watch it and have questions and comments. All right, take care. Before I go, I just don't want to say, I want to say this biblical knowledge is great, but you don't have to understand all of this. I wanted to give you this tool so that it'll remove a few of the obstacles to reading the Old Testament and making it more understandable and hopefully more relatable, so that this reading the Old Testament can be a major part of your own spiritual formation. It has been for mine. All right. Blessings.